5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.
Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. My name is Dee Moore, and I am a kidney warrior. This podcast is dedicated to encourage, educate, and inspire as we explore all aspects of kidney disease, related chronic illnesses, and health. If you have any questions or ideas for topics you would like me to cover, please get in contact with me on social media using the handle Diary of a Kidney Warrior. My guest today from Florida, USA is renal dietitian Jen Hernandez. Jen is an award-winning renal dietitian with experience across all areas of chronic kidney disease, from prevention to early stages and dialysis. Jen joins me to share about plant protein versus animal protein, supplements, and more. Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. How are you doing today, Jen?
I'm doing great, Dee. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really looking forward to our interview today. Today, we're going to be talking about plant protein versus animal protein, supplements, and CKD. Now, I really am excited to be talking about this subject because time and time again, you hear anytime there's a program about fitness or healthy lifestyle or diet or whatever it is to do with eating, or if you go into any supermarket now, you are guaranteed to see something that's high in protein. They're talking about protein. You know, you got to eat lots of protein, this, that, and the other. To live a healthy life, you've got to have protein. There's all this thing about protein. But as a person living with CKD, how much protein can I have? Is it safe for me to have protein? You know, not understanding like what it is that I need to do that's maybe different to the rest of the population. So yeah, I'm really excited to find out more. And I'm sure many people listening in are going to be like, come on, Dee, let's get on with it. I want to hear the info. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the basics really. And I want to know, what is protein?
Yeah, this is a really good question because it's one of those questions that people oftentimes want to know, but don't feel comfortable asking. And I think it's a really important thing to understand those foundations when it comes to our diet. So protein is a macronutrient, and this means it's one of the nutrients in our diet that provides more of the energy, the calories that we need. So the macronutrients include protein, fats, and carbohydrates. Those are where the bulk of our energy come from, these macronutrients. And protein itself is basically composed of amino acids. And these amino acids are the building blocks of protein. We need them for so many different functions in our body. People are most familiar with the thought of them being related to muscle health and keeping our muscles strong. But it really does do a lot of things within the body, including working with hormones, working with enzymes, working with our metabolism. And so protein is an important thing for people to eat and for people to get enough of. But there is that question about, how much is too much? And that's what I'm excited that we're going to be diving into as we talk more specifically about protein with chronic kidney disease, because there are some more specific guidelines when it comes to protein for kidney patients compared to protein in the public. Like you mentioned, the different products that you come across in the stores and how everybody is just talking about protein and how they're saying we're not getting enough or it's so much more important, which sure, it can be. But there's also things related to people with chronic kidney disease where protein is really important, but in a different kind of way.
Let's delve into that then. So in terms of a person like myself living with CKD, what are the guidelines in terms of protein?
So the protein guidelines when it comes to taking care of chronic kidney disease, it on one hand isn't that far off from general guidelines, but it feels far off from what people typically eat or what they're told or think that they're supposed to eat. So, first of all, the recommended dietary guidelines in general is 0.8 grams per kilogram for a person, not with kidney disease. So I just want to give that as some opening context as to when we're talking about these different numbers, because I will be throwing out a few numbers in this. So in general, 0.8 grams per kilogram and potentially up to 1 gram per kilogram. That's kind of the range that most general healthy people are aiming for when it comes to protein. Now, with chronic kidney disease, and first I'll dive into the earlier stages of chronic kidney disease. So I'm thinking like it's going to be around stage 3. This is where potentially a lower protein diet of around 0.6, still up to 0.8 grams per kilogram can be suitable for earlier stages of kidney disease. And also, just to give more context, these recommendations do come from international guidelines there's KDOQI and KDIGO guidelines. And so these guidelines are what dietitians and healthcare providers use as kind of our go-to resources, because those foundations, those groups are taking a lot of the evidence and the science behind what we know and compiling that into these recommendations. So I want to give some more context for that as well.
And just to add on for the listeners that what we're discussing today in terms of protein, a disclaimer, this is not medical advice. This is for educational purposes. And so for your specific needs, consult a renal dietitian, speak with your renal team so that you can get advice based on your blood results and your needs. So had to add the disclaimer there.
Absolutely. And I was going to add too, that even anything under that 0.8 grams per kilogram puts a person at higher risk of malnutrition because they might not be getting enough protein, enough of those amino acids that our body needs. There are 9 essential amino acids, meaning we have to get them from our food or from our diet in order for our body to use them and do what it needs to do with those amino acids. So that's why when we talk about even this lower protein diet, it's not something that is just off the cuff recommended just because you have kidney disease. And other things that need to be considered are other conditions that a person might have that can also influence protein need. So in these earlier stages, if they're looking at a lower protein diet, that might be influenced on other health conditions like diabetes or cancer, or other conditions that actually influence or increase protein needs. And so working with a dietitian one-on-one, you will have that person to help balance a lot of this out. Chronic kidney disease is not usually a single diagnosis, meaning I don't think I've ever come across a patient that only has kidney disease and doesn't have anything else going on. So there's a lot of factors to consider, which is what makes it more complicated. And we don't just have a very easy, have this much protein and you'll be good to go. There's a lot of nuances involved in it. So there is that lower protein diet. And in some moderate, so stages 4 and 5, there is some evidence to say that a very low protein diet, which is even underneath that 0.6 grams per kilogram, a very low protein diet paired with keto analogs, which is a protein medical food supplement, that can also potentially help protect kidney function in later stages. But I really, really do want to emphasize that this isn't a type of diet to try on your own. Keto analogs can be found online and purchased without a prescription. However, that doesn't mean they're safe to try on a whim with also lowering the protein. And I see this more often than not. Actually, many of my patients, I take them off this self-prescribed low protein diet or self-prescribed keto analog supplements because they're not at a point where it would be medically feasible or medically recommended to do. And in the event of doing any type of lower protein diet, it's also important to have your doctor on board because routine lab draws is also very important to be able to monitor for any sign of malnutrition or any other kind of issues that come up. So I really can't put enough disclaimer around that because even though guidelines do talk about a lower protein diet, it's not just something to try on a whim. And it's really important to get medically approved for that before you start it. And in fact, the KDOQI guidelines, which just came out this year, 2024, actually promoted more of reaching that zero point 0.8, reaching the RDA goal for protein, but focused more on the use of plant proteins rather than animal proteins. And they have found from that research of just including more plants in the diet, but still getting slightly more protein, that it's still kidney protective. So I would say another thing to consider is not necessarily just reducing protein, but looking at your quality and the types of protein you're getting, which is kind of circling back to why this conversation is getting into the animal versus plant protein discussion. And it's a lot of really good information and some great ideas of starting to make that switch. And just seeing that it can be helpful for kidneys is really, really important too.
So going back to that point about when you go to the supermarket, you see all of these different labels that has high in protein, protein bars, protein this, protein that. I see that there's a lot of things where protein has been added to the food. Are these proteins safe for kidney patients?
So we did cover the protein for CKD not on dialysis. And there's also the protein for people with CKD on dialysis. And in those cases, for people on dialysis, there is a higher protein goal typically, which a dialysis dietitian would give that individual target of how much protein to reach. But protein is oftentimes on the dialysis side more encouraged because of the medical treatment of dialysis and how it is getting some protein out of the body. It needs to be replenished. That's also paired with many dialysis patients report having a lower appetite and not feeling as hungry. And so it's harder for them to just get enough protein in that sense as well. So to answer the question about, protein being added into foods, I would say on that one side of the coin of dialysis dependency, where someone needs dialysis with end-stage kidney failure, having foods that have a little bit of extra protein can be helpful. It's not something that we need to necessarily have at every single meal with every single snack. It doesn't need to be force-fed, for lack of a better word, because protein is pushed so heavily. But there are so many even plant options that don't have added protein, but are naturally higher in protein. So, for example, like edamame is a natural plant protein source, but it's 1 cup of edamame has 18 grams of protein in it. And so that can be a good protein source for somebody who has a higher protein need. And the other benefit of it is also that it comes with fiber, which is incredibly important for any kidney patient. And again, on the dialysis side, many dialysis patients don't get enough fiber. So getting more fiber in the diet is another benefit of having the plant proteins too. So then on the other hand, when we're talking about CKD not on dialysis in those mild to moderate stages, I'm not typically recommending more protein. I'm recommending hitting the right amount, as in whatever target we set for a patient, and making sure that they're getting more plants than animal proteins coming in. And so supplements is only going to be added in if I have somebody who's really struggling with not eating well for some reason, whatever is going on there, but it's never, ever something that I jump right into. So that's kind of a last case resort. And fortunately, that's good because a lot of those kinds of foods, they market the protein, which then they increase the price of the food. So, the goal is to not spend so much money on these highly marketed foods too.
So you touched on plant protein as being an alternative to animal protein. And as we said, the title of today's podcast is Plant Protein versus Animal Protein. So let's look at the benefits of plant protein and what we should be aiming for as people with CKD.
Yeah, with plant proteins, it doesn't mean that a person has to be 100% plant-based or 100% vegan, but a great goal is to make a transition to where half of your proteins are coming from plant sources, rather than always focusing on animal sources. And this can be beneficial in so many ways. As I already mentioned, for one, plant proteins will provide oftentimes fiber, and this is something that is not found in animal protein foods. So by using more plant proteins, you're giving yourself more fiber. And another, context or number for people to be targeting is for women, the general recommendation is 25 grams of fiber per day. And for men, the general recommendation is 38 grams per day. And so that sounds like it's not that high, but most people aren't getting enough fiber to begin with. And if we think about some of the traditional renal diet recommendations, like avoiding potassium, foods that are rich in potassium are also oftentimes rich in fiber. So there's this inherent avoidance, essentially, of fiber. But if we're able to reintroduce and get more fiber back into the diet via more plant proteins, this fiber can be really helpful for our gut health, which helps with our bowel movements, helps get everything, the waste moving through our body. It is incredibly important. And constipation is, I believe, the number one symptom or side effect that kidney patients will have from a multitude of reasons, but it is the most common GI problem that kidney patients will have. So getting more fiber in the diet can be really helpful to alleviate that constipation. So that's one benefit of plant proteins over animal. Another benefit is something, and this could be, I would say, probably a whole other conversation, but PRAL. PRAL stands for potential renal acid load. And this is basically a calculation of the acid that is produced from the food that we're eating. It's not necessarily pH, but it is using this calculation of the protein, the phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium in a food item and letting the body know, okay, based on how much protein, how much phosphorus, how much of these nutrients, this is either the acid load or the alkaline load that would be a result of digesting this food. And this is a really heavy it's a really heavy topic and it gets super sciencey, but I will just try to keep it really high level by saying that plant proteins have a more negative PRAL, which is a good thing. Plant proteins have a more negative PRAL value compared to animal proteins that are more positive PRAL or more acid producing. And so something, let's say for dialysis patients and for later stage CKD, dialysis patients have the bicarbonate in their dialysate that is helping to counteract the acidity. And late stage kidney patients who are not on dialysis, they might be prescribed sodium bicarbonate tabs. So this is a common medication in later stages to help offset the acidity. However, and this is definitely not saying to go against any type of doctor's orders, but I do think it's an important conversation to have with the doctor about how making a switch to a more plant-dominant diet, how that can modify the acid balance in the body. And it's important for the doctor to know about because they can monitor the labs. They can look at the bicarbonate levels and either in dialysis or via medication, they'll be able to make adjustments based off of the changes that are made in the diet. And I have seen this so much with clients who have come off medication once they're able to prove that they can consistently have more plants in the diet that helps to offset that acidity. So that's an example of how a diet can make a big impact with medications in this case, just by switching the protein source because of this different type of balance of nutrients that we're getting.
Just slightly coming off the subject kind of thing, I hear a lot about alkaline diets. So trying not to veer too much off the subject here, but just to quickly ask the question, is there any benefit for kidney patients following an alkaline diet?
It really does fall in line with that discussion with PRAL. So I would say the basics of it with an alkaline diet, they're saying eat more fruits and vegetables, which as dietitians, we can continue to say every single day for the rest of our lives. And somehow somebody will try to capitalize it with a different type of dietary term. So alkaline diet is one of those like trendy terms. But again, at the foundation of it, it is about eating more fruits and vegetables to have more alkalinity. I'm not crazy about this term, but it's a term I know a lot of people use, the standard American diet or the SAD diet. I use that in quotations, the SAD diet. That is much more protein heavy and therefore it's more acid producing. And so that is kind of this transition from going from a traditional American diet that is pushing protein, as we've talked about, protein in everything, but then also phosphorus, which is a whole other part of the conversation. But that does have that can make a difference with that PRAL acidity versus alkalinity as well. The protein and the phosphorus are the two that will negatively, badly impact PRAL levels. And then the potassium, magnesium, calcium, those ones will positively or benefit the PRAL value. So yeah, that's kind of a big, quick and dirty run through of PRAL and what it's like, and in the way that it's kind of connected to the alkaline diet.
Just very quickly, because I mean, it's something that we've spoken about before on the podcast. When it comes to potassium, on social media, you always see posts, kidney diet, you can't have potassium, you can't eat bananas, you can't eat this, you can't eat that, blah, blah, blah. And we've spoken about this on the podcast before, but for those who may be tuning in for the first time, I just really wanted to make the point when it comes to potassium, not to be afraid of potassium as a kidney patient and basically follow your blood results. So it might be okay, according to your blood results, for you to eat bananas and avocados and potatoes, etc., not just follow generic blanket advice when it comes to what you eat. Would you agree with that? I just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, 1,000%. I would 1,000% agree with that. And that's something that I spend a lot of my time educating people on, is that there's no such thing as the renal diet. It's not a one size fits all. And even these guidelines that have come out, the KDIGO, they talk about specifically potassium and how it needs to be focused on the individual and the lab results. We used to think just because somebody had kidney disease, we're thinking, oh, they can't manage potassium that well, we better hold back on potassium. So it started being everybody with CKD needs to be watching, limiting, restricting potassium. But there's really no research out to prove that dietary potassium is linked to our blood potassium. But we do see that people who are overly cutting back on potassium are not getting enough nutrients in the diet. And it's aggravating because potassium is actually really powerful in supporting blood pressure. And so when we think about somebody with early stage CKD, if they're going into this, looking online and seeing these recommendations from companies that are talking about a low potassium diet for somebody with kidney disease, and they're thinking, oh, I have kidney disease, I should be limiting my potassium, they're sacrificing an entirely huge opportunity to protect their kidney function and improve blood pressure. So, and I can tell you too, from my one-on-one patients, I have people with late stage kidney disease who are on potassium supplements. And so there is no one size fits all. And it is incredibly important to discuss with your provider. And also, I would say some providers, especially doctors, they are doing a million things. They have so much to cover. They do not have the time to stay up to date with nutrition. And so they might not know all of the updated nutrition guidelines. So if that conversation about nutrition is coming up with your provider, with your doctor, it's a great opportunity to ask for a referral to a renal dietitian, because that's what we do. That's how we spend our time day in and day out. That's what we study and we are experienced with. And so we can dedicate a lot more time with somebody to talk more about that nutrition and provide that support. So that's another thing too, is I would just say be cautious. There are a lot of great doctors who do keep up and promote or participate in research for renal nutrition, but not all doctors do that. So if you don't feel comfortable with your doctor about nutrition, ask for a referral to a renal dietitian, because that's 100% our jam.
So we've talked about plant protein. Let's look at animal protein. Like some people, they can handle some vegetables, but they really do want to eat some meat. And I'm here to promote choice when it comes to whether somebody wants to do exclusively plant-based or mixing some animal protein in there. I just want to get the right balance. Do you get to the point? I just want to get to the right balance when it comes to letting people know what the options are and what is safe for them. So in terms of animal protein, what are the recommendations?
So the recommendations with animal protein, I'm in the same boat. And I do like to promote more plants, but it doesn't have to be only plants. And it is really important as a dietitian that when I work with somebody, we're starting from where somebody is at and not doing a total 180 into let's say they're a meat and potatoes. That's a very common phrase of I'm a meat and potatoes kind of person. That's how I grew up. That's how a lot of people in the boomer generation grew up, meat and potatoes. And it's that generation that's also seeing a lot of kidney problems that we're trying to say, okay, more plants, but not necessarily all or only plants. So if anything, we're looking at making sure that you're focusing on lean proteins. So fish is a good option because it is more lean and it does provide more heart healthy benefits, more healthy fats. It's part of the Mediterranean diet, which is one of the most studied and CKD friendly diets available that we have seen that is well researched. So including some fish can be helpful. Other lean proteins like poultry, like chicken, can be good as well. Or some of the vegetarian protein options like eggs and yogurt, cheese, dairy products, those can also fit into a renal diet. And when I have somebody that says, okay, but I have to have some animal protein, like I'm not going to give up my chicken, then we say, okay, that's fine. We talk about keeping it to a smaller portion size, which portions are really distorted nowadays. We get a lot of strange portion sizes when we go out to eat at restaurants. We get influenced by how much people are eating at family get-togethers, or even in just in our immediate family. We see how somebody might be eating a ton of it and think, oh, that's a serving, or that's a normal, what would be okay for me. But everybody is going to be individualized. So we'll look at taking that animal protein and cutting it to about a quarter of the plate, whereas maybe before it was like a half of the plate. So we cut it down in the portion size. And I'm also a big fan of not just removing something, but what are we adding to the plate? We're not going to be eating from empty plates. So it's really important that we're putting something onto that plate to help it be satisfying. And this is, again, a great opportunity where we talk about including more vegetables, whole grains, anything else that provides some color and nutrients onto the plate to help protect kidney function, give more of this variety of nutrients that all these different foods with different colors can provide.
You mentioned about lean protein. Is red meat safe, or should red meat be completely avoided?
In general, red meat is something to limit or avoid. This is actually a conversation I just had in our Facebook group. I believe somebody was asking about this, and it is something that has been shown time and time again to have a negative effect on our health, not just kidneys, but cardiovascular health is important, increasing the risk of cancer. There's not a ton of benefits that solely come from red meat. I know some people will say, oh, well, it has iron. And yes, that's true. It has iron, but it's not the only type of food that has iron in it. And so I think in many cases with red meat, that the cons more so outweigh the pros. But again, if someone is coming from having red meat 5 times a week, then we're not necessarily going to cut it down to 0, but we're going to start making gradual changes to make a switch to a more lean protein, a healthier option. And then also continuously checking in and making sure, because that's another part of this too, as you're making changes and adding food, and you want to pay attention to your body. You want to honor what your body is telling you. And many people do notice the benefits, and that helps with getting the ball rolling and making these changes and reminding you of what you're doing and how it helps your body, because your body tells you that it's feeling better many times, but we just have to take the time to listen. So that's another thing when we talk about making those changes, making gradual changes, and then paying attention to what's going on.
So do animal proteins impact potassium and phosphorus levels?
So surprisingly, they can. And I think this is also something where many patients from the old renal diet ideas, they have blinders on. And I will admit to you, when I was a renal dietitian in dialysis, this was something that wasn't talked about as much several years ago. But more and more research is coming out to show that animal proteins can have an impact. So for example, with potassium, I remember talking about protein and saying dialysis patients need more protein. I had a patient in one of my clinics who had a kind of a higher potassium, and that was kind of a chronic problem. And his protein, his albumin was a little bit low. And I was doing rounds with the nephrologist, and the nephrologist was saying, okay, you got to watch out for your potassium, but I need you to eat more protein. And so he was actually promoting the patient to eat a ribeye, which, as a dietitian, I'm like, well, let's talk about some other options. But it was talking about, okay, more protein, but be careful with potassium. And animal proteins do have potassium. Animal meat, just like us, our muscle, our tissues, we have potassium, and animals also have potassium. And I think a lot of times this is forgotten when we are looking at potassium and we are worried about high potassium levels. because many times animal meat can be higher than plant proteins with potassium. So for example, like 3 ounces of chicken will have about 300 milligrams of potassium, whereas 3 ounces of tofu will have about 100 milligrams of potassium. So it is actually much lower in potassium. It is lower in protein, but it is also lower in potassium. So there's kind of that. And many times people don't need, as we talked about, they don't need as much protein as we think. So even something like tofu that's providing 9 grams of protein in 3 ounces, it's just not providing as much potassium. So all of that to say, if potassium is a concern, I just don't want people demonizing fruits and vegetables to be the problem, where animal proteins, especially if someone thinks they have to eat a lot more animal protein, don't forget that the animal protein does come with potassium. Now, on the phosphorus side of things, this is also something that is of interest because we know now that added phosphates, the inorganic phosphates, this is the ingredient of phosphorus that's added to a food. So one of the classic examples is Coke having phosphoric acid. That's a classic example. If you look on your can of cola or whatever kind of dark sodas, many times, not all of them, but many of them, you can find phosphoric acid as an ingredient. That's an example of an added phosphate, which is absorbed 100%. And that can have a really big impact on phosphorus. Animal proteins also, just like potassium, they come with organic or natural phosphorus. And while it's not as highly absorbed as the added phosphates, it is still absorbed around 80% of the phosphorus that's in animal proteins. And plant proteins, they also do come with phosphorus, but plant proteins are only absorbed by about 50%. So the absorption rate coming from plants, including whole grains, nuts, seeds, very minimally fruits and vegetables, because they're not considered really higher in phosphorus. But the amount of phosphorus from plants is just lower, less absorbed for phosphorus. So it is another win, or it's another pro in including some more plant proteins, because you're not going to be getting as much phosphorus from your foods. And especially if you're going for minimally processed fruits and vegetables, which do include canned and frozen, as long as it's not like covered in a sauce or something like that, it has a much lower likelihood that there's an added phosphate. So this is a way to get more nutrients without getting more phosphorus. And phosphorus it can be incredibly hard for a kidney patient to manage because of how it's in everything. And it's so prevalent. So making a switch into some more plants, that can be really, really powerful in managing phosphorus.
Just another add-on question, not trying to veer off the topic too much, but when you mentioned about tinned or canned foods, some of these come in salted water. So obviously we know we have to be careful of salt, but some come in brine. Is brine safe for kidney patients, or is this something we should avoid?
It really depends on the specific product, because companies can make what they want within safety, within regulations, but the liquid that a food is in might have added potassium or added phosphates. However, that being said, canned beans, for example, are actually lower in potassium than their dried to cooked counterparts, because the canning process reduces the potassium. And so a canned legume or a canned bean is a better, lower potassium option and can be more fitting for somebody. However, I always put the caveat, it's not as likely, but I put the caveat in that you want to check the ingredients for those added phosphates or added potassium additives just in the event that they have them, because companies can put them in without any type of notice or warning. And newer upcoming health concerns, such as not having as much sodium in the diet, some companies are using potassium substitutes or potassium salt substitutes. And this can also increase potassium content from a potassium additive, which, like a phosphorus additive, is more highly absorbed. So that is another kind of consideration to make. But practicing label reading, I would say, is one of the things that a kidney patient, the more you do it, the more you practice it, the more empowered you'll feel by what you see and how you kind of like identify foods that are better, identify options that work for you, rather than having a lot of question marks of if this is okay or not. But looking at the label will give you a ton of information.
So another thing that I see quite often is, again, in the fitness industry. If you go into the gym, you see many people walking around with their bottle with protein drinks in them, and the whey protein being the main source of the protein drinks that I see people, or protein supplements that people take. Is whey protein and protein drinks safe for kidney patients to drink?
I would say this also is kind of looking at that divider between chronic kidney disease and then chronic kidney disease on dialysis. It's that dialysis that makes the biggest difference. And so if a person is, as I mentioned earlier, on dialysis and struggling with getting enough protein, then a protein supplement can be incredibly helpful. And there were so many times as a dialysis dietitian that I would recommend a protein supplement for a patient who wasn't getting enough protein based off of a diet recall, based off of a conversation and finding out how much protein they're getting. But CKD not on dialysis, who is more oftentimes just trying to find a better balance of protein in the diet, a high protein supplement is not likely going to be the right solution. Having maybe like a higher calorie, like a smoothie or something that has some protein in it can be good, but you don't need to add more protein into it. So for example, a smoothie, if you make it with some yogurt versus adding protein powder, the yogurt is going to give you some protein in it, but it's not going to give you such a heavy protein load like the protein powder, one scoop providing 20 to 30 grams. I mean, that scoop of protein powder in of itself could count for half, if not more, of a person's protein goal for the day. So doing a heavy protein supplement in those earlier and mild and even later stages, not on dialysis, it's never something that I'm jumping into. If anything, we're talking about how to get more calories from other nutrients like carbohydrates and fats.
So that's definitely given me a lot to think about. I've learned a lot there in terms of protein, and thinking about, especially for myself as a dialysis patient, because that was something I became aware of, that because I'm now on hemodialysis, that my protein needs are going to be different. So it's definitely, I feel more empowered by the information that you've shared today. So thank you for that, Jen.
Yeah, I'm happy that you found it helpful. I love talking about this stuff. And while I'm not in dialysis anymore, I'm not working in dialysis anymore, I have always really loved, and I miss my dialysis patients. It's always fun, whether they wanted to see me or not. It was always fun to connect with them. So I'm glad you appreciate it. And it's been a really good conversation. I appreciate all your questions.
So while we're talking about connections, I know that you're very active on social media. So what are your handles for the listeners so they can give you a follow?
Yeah, I love being on social media most of the time. And so you can find us Plant Powered Kidneys on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook as well at Plant Powered Kidneys. And we also have a free but private Facebook group. You can also look in the Facebook groups for Plant Powered Kidneys. And I just mentioned that's a private group because that is something you can join, and anything you post in there will not be put on your Facebook wall for everyone that you are connected with to see. So it's private in that sense that you can connect with like-minded kidney warriors and have that privacy.
So do give Jen a follow, and that's Plant Powered Kidneys on Insta and on Facebook. And as always, I will put the links to Jen's pages in the description box so you can find Jen and give Jen a follow. So today we've talked about plant protein, animal protein, whey protein, supplements, protein drinks, and we've talked about the protein guidelines and CKD. And so I wanted to leave the final word with you, Jen. And so what is your final word of encouragement for the listeners?
I would say a word of encouragement is whatever you're doing a great job, because I know that, not from a personal experience, but from my years working with all kinds of kidney patients, that whatever you're doing, you're putting in so much effort, and you're putting in so much work for yourself to keep healthy and to do what you can do. And whatever you're doing is great. And this is the point where I start getting emotional, because I just feel like I'm always just so much in awe for kidney patients and everything they do. So whatever you're doing, I'm very proud of you, and I hope you're proud of yourself too.
Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for the information that you've shared. Thank you for your encouragement. I know this will help so many people. Thank you so, so much.
Very happy to help in any way I can.
Thank you for listening to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. And don't forget that you can contact me on social media using the handle Diary of a Kidney Warrior. Please do subscribe to the podcast, and please do tell a friend. New episodes of this podcast are released every other Monday. Until next time, take care and choose to live.
Diary of a Kidney Warrior, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.